Hey, everybody, this is Tom Cooke. Good afternoon, July 7th, about 3 o'clock Eastern Time. We are here with, of course, my broadcast partner, Dennis Crowley, and the great Glenn Guzzo. Okay. The people who some people think is great, the person who some people think is great, Glenn Guzzo from Strat-O-Matic, author, former journalist, Strat-O-Matic guru. Glenn, thank you for joining us this year.
Pleasure always.
We're going to be going over the Strat football ratings. And I feel like I'm off to a slow start. What's wrong with me, Dennis? What's going on here? What am I doing wrong?
Oh, well, you didn't let me say anything. That's the problem.
I should let Dennis always does the introduction, and it's great. We should restart. And I try to do it.
You're good.
You know, Dennis, give us a better introduction. Dennis does it. I get all pumped up and I'm ready, and I blew it this year. Dennis, you give a new introduction. Good.
No, the introduction was fine. Let's cut to the chase. Glenn, you may not think you're great, but we think you're great. I mean, you wrote a book about all of our favorite hobbies. If you're watching this, you're a Strat fan, and Glenn is one of the ultimate Strat fans. So we appreciate the work you do on the football card set. We're so excited when it got released. Got released even a day early from what you told us. So
that's right.
What you told Tom. So thank you for that. And let's get into the ratings. Like how was it this year? Just putting together this set, because it certainly seems this set is a lot different than last set.
There are differences, and it was a struggle. It's become more of a struggle each year in the last several. A good bit of that has to do with the evolution of the NFL itself, and how do we adjust, if we can, the game ratings and the rules to keep pace in a way that doesn't destroy the play value of the game. I mean, you can add all kinds of complexity. You can fine-tune, make exceptions, add rules, have more detailed rules. And there are some people out there who would want every bit of that detail. But for a game to be popular, really nothing is more important than whether it is fun to play and whether it is easy enough to play. And so I've always wanted games that had statistical accuracy, but I've had games that have great statistical accuracy and are practically unplayable. I play them once or twice, they go on the shelf, they end up getting traded or sold. And Strat-O-Matic from day one has always tried to be different from that, while still having statistical accuracy, to have realism, but also to have this play value. So it's gotten to be more difficult because the NFL not only is evolving, but in one particular way of its evolution, is players becoming much more specialized. Many guys being played in very specific roles that make it a challenge for us to make sure the team plays right, while also having the ratings have integrity across the card set. Something for your listeners always to keep in mind is that first, we are concerned with the stock team value, and the draft league consideration is important to us, but it's secondary. And this is in big part because more than any other Strat-O-Matic sport, people play the stock teams. And it's true in all the sports, Strat-O-Matic sports, that stock teams are more popular than draft leagues. That is counterintuitive to people who play draft leagues, so they think everybody plays draft leagues. I was like that at one time. But it's not true. Every survey we conducted in StratFan, every survey Strat-O-Matic has run, both before StratFan and since, have shown that stock team play is more popular, and especially so in football. And I think especially so in football because of the team cards. The team defense, but also the team blocking, the team individual team defenders. And that is going to play into some of the questions we'll deal with today, because we deal with them every year. And that is, we have to be very mindful that, for instance, a sub cannot be better than a starter. You can't have a starter on the bench who's a 6 and then have a sub who actually played more games, started more games, and is a 4 or a 0, because what will happen? The game player will just change the order, and then the team will not play the way it is statistically designed to play, or the way the team played in real life. So it's become more of a challenge in that I've had to contend with those sort of competing principles. And some teams were especially difficult to do because they're moving their players around so much on defense. Is this guy going to be an outside linebacker? Is this team really going to be a 3-4? It looks like they actually, said they were a 3-4, but lined up in a 4-3 more often. Tricky stuff like that. And then, of course, we've added some complexity to the ratings over the recent years, when we gave linebackers and safeties double ratings instead of just an overall rating. They now separated for pass and run. We added things like 2-team receptions for certain receivers. And we continue to try to tweak the game in a way that does not require extra dice rolls or heavy-duty thinking that makes the game less playable.
Can you, when you talk about the challenge that NFL specialization brings to you, do you see it more on the defensive side of the ball or on the offensive side of the ball in recent years? And could you give examples of both?
It is in both, but it's way more on defense because the offensive line is the most stable part of the team.
Sure.
So you got 5 guys who are the starters. They just, they get hurt and they go out. But unless the team is particularly very, very unhappy with a certain guy, they're pretty much sticking with there's 5, and the left tackle always plays left tackle, and the right tackle always plays right tackle, and so on. Center always plays center. There occasionally a team will switch in midseason, like the Bears did last year, the year before, with Whitehair and what was the other guy? Daniels.
James Daniels.
Yeah. And so, they started with Daniels at center and Whitehair at left guard after Whitehair had been the center for years. Decided that wasn't going to work after all, move Whitehair back to center. That is extremely rare. And if you're a center, you're a center. If you're a starting center, that's all you play usually. And many teams have only one guy who played center all year. So the challenge for the offensive line sometimes is to come up with the adequate number of substitutes to rate. But defense is, and while offense, it does have issues with so many guys splitting wide. You get tight ends who split wide. You get running backs who split wide. You have 2 tight end offenses becoming very, very frequent. And Strat-O-Matic's card for the offensive alignment doesn't allow for a 2 tight end offense. So what we'll do is we will take a second tight end and give him a blocking back rating, even if he hardly ever played blocking back.
Excuse me, Glenn, when you say Strat-O-Matic's card, do you mean that like offensive line card?
Correct.
And are you referring to more of a 2 tight end, 2 wide receiver, 1 running back offense, as opposed to the Strat tight end offense where there's only 1 receiver on the field, correct?
Right. So there are a fair number of players, and I'm sure you've noticed it in this set. A lot of guys who are principally tight ends who hardly ever played blocking back are getting a blocking back rating. And their blocking back rating for run block is less than their tight end rating. That is on purpose to encourage gamers to line up in a 2 tight end offense rather than a blocking back.
Well, it's interesting that you led with that as an example of specialization, because I was asked a question, and I guess I'll jump ahead to that one now. Let me find it here. That, okay, a couple of years ago, there was a fair number of blocking backs. Here we go. Okay, let me share my screen here because there's numbers involved.
So while Tom gets that up, this kind of goes along with why we're seeing a handful of halfbacks getting rated with a 4 blocking rating. Is that so that they can line up as blocking back as well? kind of simulating them going out, lining up in the slot and going out as a target?
Well, going out wide as a target does not give them the a run block.
Right, but what I'm saying is that instead of carding them as a wide receiver, you're now giving a 4 to them so that by Strat rules, they can line up as a blocking back as well with another halfback in the halfback slot.
They can. And you could still make the argument that none of these guys deserves a 4 because they're not really – mostly they're in a one-back offense and they're not doing much blocking. On the other hand, we have more running quarterbacks than we used to have. And we also it's also just turned out this year that the considerations we use, some statistical, some scouting, gave these guys better ratings for run blocks. And so it was a little harm done, especially in the stock team format. It's like, well, who's he really going to be blocking for anyway? They're not running a two-back offense very much. And in fact, even in a two-back offense, the blocking back rating comes up very seldom. It's only on a 12 roll on the defensive card. And so if you're running if the other guy is running 360 times a year, that's a lot, right? So maybe 280 times a year. You've got the 12 coming up 1 out of every 72 rolls, right? And so if it's 288 carries, potentially that blocking rating could be used. It's really only going to be used 4 times on the statistic. Now you're going to get some plus or minus on that, but that's the statistical part of it. And the difference is 1 yard or 6 yards on that blocking back rating. So 4 times a difference of 5 yards. Difference between a 0 running blocking back and a 6 blocking back, which of course could be the fullback or could be the halfback, depending on the formation, is 20 yards a year. So really not worth a heck of a lot of our time, I think, to try to overanalyze whether this 4 should have been a 0.
Yeah, there's an example of the stock team versus the draft league. Because in the draft leagues, we play those draft league defenses. There are additional blocking ratings on those cards. There's 3 units of blocking back, I believe, in each of the columns. And of course, if you run the blocking back formation and you run to the so-called weak side, you run to your offensive left side, then offensive onside end also brings the blocking back in play. So we might have an extra interest in those blocking back 5s and 6s with the run blocking than your stock team replay guy. That's us overly self-important draft league guys, Dennis.
Yeah, you guys are playing at a really high level, and you're finding an edge by saying, hey, this is how I can take advantage of this rating to get the extra yards when I really need them. That's great. I think that's what an NFL coach does. He tries to find the right mismatch, tries to find the situation that works against one opponent that doesn't work against another. That's fine. But I think the norm of the way people play is they're going to line up and send their guys to go. Boom. And that's one of the reasons we have to be so careful that the subs aren't rated better than the starters, except under very specific situations. And because people are pretty much going to go with the starters rather than substituting in a lot. They'll come up with a third wide receiver on a nickel back. They might bring in a pass rush specialist, but it doesn't get a lot more sophisticated than that.
Sure. Hey, yes, excuse me a minute there, but you're typing a little heavy there, and the noise of your keystrokes is pretty loud. So I don't know what we can do about that, but just try to be aware of that. Well, Glenn, since Dennis touched upon it, so I feel like I missed the rationale. Why do you feel like this year you decided to give these 10 halfbacks, I think it is, that someone counted, a run block 4 when the last couple of years they've almost all been 0s? Yeah,
well, it's just the way it turned out with the rating system stuff, the inputs we have. That's worth me explaining for anybody who's new to these broadcasts, haven't read about it than anything I've written. And that is that, first of all, there is no one statistical source that counts so heavily that we would throw out everything else. In fact, this is true for all the Strat-O-Matic sports. Every statistical indicator that we've ever come up with has its limitations. And the metrics often disagree with each other, one metric versus another metric, which is proof that they can't really be taken. You can't just take one and say that's your system if you want a credible system. Credible in the way of saying, look, we've really done our homework on this. So we use multiple statistical indicators to come up with a statistical rationale for a guy. But then we also have a scouting basis. We actually hire a scouting service that is putting eyes on these guys and knows more about what these guys' assignments were. So, for instance, Pro Football Focus is a great statistical source, but they don't use the playbooks. They're looking at the video and say, okay, this guy missed a block or whatever, but they don't really know what the guy's assignment was. And also, Pro Football Focus, as far as I know, is not doing anything on strength of schedule or quality of opponent. All plays are equal. So we are weighing other things in addition to the statistical stuff. Pro Football Focus is not the only statistical source we're interested in. And we also have the scouting. And then further, we do a lot of reading. I subscribe to about 10 newspapers online. I also look at the various sources that you might look at, ESPN's, NFL.com, SI.com, some other sources out there specific to pro football. And I make a lot of notes all season long, specifically about how a guy is being used, whether he's disappointing in one facet of the game, whether he's somehow not as good or as better than he was last year. These kinds of things are very, very important. So fortunately for Strat-O-Matic, which doesn't want to reveal its formulas, less fortunate for gamers who want to know everything they can to be prepared about who they should draft or their favorite team, it's not transparent. It's not going to be, well, all I have to do is look up this statistical indicator and I know what this guy's going to get rated. That's not the case. And for me, it's a mosaic. I've got the stats, I've got the scouting reports, I've got the reading, but also the team performance. And then I have what I talked about was the integrity of the ratings across the set. Do we have a consistent approach here? Do we have exceptions? Do we have a pretty good reason why we're doing that? And it's a puzzle. I love solving puzzles. But these are puzzles that have no one right answer in many cases. So if somebody wants to say, well, gee, I think this team would play better if this cornerback was a 5 instead of a 4, and instead you could have done this with this team to compensate for it. Well, that might be true. In the end, you make a decision. Say that I think this is the best way to go. So we can quibble.
So one of the things you're saying, and that was a very interesting to hear exactly how you feel like you put together your opinions on individual players. But it sounds like you're saying that there are quite a few players out there where you are on the fence on a rating. Maybe it's a 4, maybe it's a 5. And by the end of the day, you can only pick one. You can't make him a 4.5. And and you could see someone saying, yeah, sure, maybe the guy should have been a 5, maybe he should have been a 4. But hey, I can only pick one number, and this is the one I went with.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In baseball, where we're rating an awful lot of players as well, I would say it's close to majority of players who are on the fence. Could be a 4 or 5 defensively, a 3 or a 4, 2 or 3, 1 or 2. In football, it's even more of a challenge because it's a 16-game season. It's not a 162-game season. And most players don't play 16 games. And so now you've got a much smaller base performance-based to work from. And the volatility of the ratings of a particular player or even a whole team from one season to the next can be very, very, very big volatility because you're dealing with such a small statistical base in the first place. Let's say a team that played 16 games, here's a guy who played 13 or 12, 9, and he was a 5. And now next year, his team's fallen off. He's been a part of it. And now maybe he's a 0.
Okay, well, Glenn, real quick, that explains individual guys how they go their rating. I totally get that, but there's one group that we've seen a really big sea change, and that's in the blocking back run ratings. This question is from Larry Davis, the Autumn Wind commissioner. He says, in 2017, you had 57 players that were blocking backs. 2 of those guys got 6s, 14 had 5s, and 28 had 4s. Now, in this set, we see 0.6 blocking back run ratings, 0.6 or 0.5 blocking back run ratings, and only 4 have a blocking back rating of 4, while 54 now have a run block rating of 0. What, instead of, like, I know you're saying people are on the fence, this and that, what causes a big change like that for an entire group?
This is not on the fence issue. It's what I was talking about earlier. 2 tight end offenses. Most of these guys were not blocking backs.
So that's
or blocking backs only a few plays all year. And they did not have good blocking ratings to go with it, statistically, or our scouting reports to go with it. So we have a lot of tight ends or blocking backs now who are starters or subs who are 0 blocking backs and 4 at tight end.
Got it.
And that is specifically to encourage gamers to play the team the way it was really played. And that is 2 tight ends, not a blocking back.
Perfect. Thank you. That answers it perfect.
So so as recently as 2 years ago, were that many more NFL teams using a blocking back in their formations?
Yes. It was now, even then, we were mindful of this, but it has only increased. Fewer teams have a fullback. Fewer teams go into a short yardage blocking situation. Some of these blocking backs who get a blocking back rating in Strat-O-Matic have been a blocking back for fewer than 3 plays per game. But we need for the computer game as well to have a fullback and a backup or a blocking back and a backup. So, and that's true for the board game as well in case of injury. So we are rating some guys at blocking back as subs who never even played it.
Okay.
And then there are starters who, as I say, they were really tight ends. Started 11 games at tight end, started none at blocking back. But I've got 2 tight ends. One who started at 14 games or 16 games. The other guy started 11. One of them's going to be a blocking back because of the card frame.
All right, we'll probably get back a little bit in a minute to this thing about the backups and some guys getting rated to fill out the depth charts and the injury and have backups for injury. But let me advance down this list of questions we have here. We had a lot of questions this year, Glenn. I put a thread up on the Strat Fan forum. Guys who are listening, Glenn told me that he was checking out the thread, looking at questions, getting ready. I think it was interesting because Glenn told me that he's looking at the questions, and then a guy asked, "Hey, you guys giving Glenn the questions ahead of time?" I was like, "Well, you guys are giving Glenn the questions ahead of time. You're posting them. You can read them, So anyway, but which is good because we all want to be prepared and get the best information we can. We're not playing a game of gotcha over here. We're trying to learn more about the game. But so Glenn, this was a question that people had. Do you keep track of how many overall players get rated each year? Like any rating, 0, 4, 5, 6, whatever. Because a couple of coaches felt like this year it seems like there are more players rated than usual. Is that the case this year? And do you keep track of this every year or no?
Then we have a standard thing for the defense, and that is we can have up to 14 subs. That's how much the card will hold. All right, so that's the same every year. All right, now we're looking for 14 guys. There's the very, very rare team that doesn't have 14 guys to use. We usually have more than 14 to choose from. But in many cases, we're talking about guys with very, very few snaps as those 13th and 14th subs. So we've always going to have 11 starters and 14 subs with very rare exceptions for defense. For offense, we have the same number of carded skill players every year. We have the same number of starting offensive linemen every year. The only difference is how many sub-offensive linemen are there. And I like to have as many subs as I can get. Usually the problem is not enough because you have a center who played every snap. There was no backup center. So what do I do in that situation? I look for a guy who used to be a center or a guy who on the depth chart is the backup center. That's even better. And he gets a center rating of 0 to go with whatever other position he played. But I always want to make sure we got a backup center, backup guard, and a backup tackle at least. And if I can get 2, even better. So the only variance on the number of guys rated are going to be substitute offensive linemen.
Okay.
Maybe a third quarterback, but it's still same number of skill players, right? There's still going to be 13 skilled players rated on every team. Whether it's 2 quarterbacks, 3 quarterbacks, or 4 quarterbacks, it's still the same number of skill players.
Now, when you said up to 14 defensive subs, are there teams where you will end up with fewer than 14 subs?
I think I said very, very rarely.
Okay.
Usually the way around where there's more candidates than that.
All right. Then a corresponding question. Someone asked if there will be any computer-only players this year. I think they said that Mark Sanchez was a computer-only card with Washington recently.
Every year, I wish that we could rate a couple of extra guys, maybe 5 extra guys as skill players. The way the cards are done, we're limited to a certain number. And sometimes I go ahead and rate those players for a late decision on which guy we're going to card. And in those situations, we may just go ahead and include the guy in the computer game. But it's not by design that we're going to have this many extra guys for the computer.
Sure. It's not like baseball where it's like, okay, like everyone who gets to the bat nowadays pretty much gets a computer card or something like that. So,
right.
Okay.
Correct.
And you said maybe 5 guys in the entire NFL.
Yeah, I mean it's not a hard number. It's not a quota.
Sure. Yeah, just an approximation.
Whatever we've got a situation where teams started 4 quarterbacks, but when they to card all 4 means we're going to have to eliminate some wide receiver at 20 catches or some running back with 30 carries, 40 carries. And so in those situations, sometimes I go ahead and do the extra work on the extra guy, and it ends up in the computer game.
Okay, there you go. That's an excellent explanation. Thank you. All right, so this is a big one, Glenn, that we've addressed before, and that the community is always asking about. Who gets a card and who doesn't get a card? Who gets rated and who doesn't get a card? There's been a lot of theories floating around out there. Well, if you play this many games, or if you finish the season as the starter, and we've got some specific examples here. But first, why don't you tell us in general, like, what are you thinking about when you have these guys who played 5 or 6 games? And we're talking mostly about non-skill players. Okay, we're talking about non-skill players for the most part. So for the non-skill players, who gets rated, doesn't get rated? What are some situations where a guy played a fair amount and doesn't get rated, or a guy hardly played and did get rated?
Right. There's no minimum amount for a guy to be a sub. Right. So guy played 1 game and he's the backup center because there was no other backup center. He's the guy. Okay. Or some defensive lineman who played 4 games and had a sack. We want to rate everybody who had a sack. And so he gets rated. There's no minimum amount of playing time that is required to be rated. There is just a limit on the number of players we can rate. Now, for starters, it's entirely different. You have to have 8 starts to be a starter. Second, there's an exception, and that is a guy who started the season, got hurt, and came back to return as a starter. And in that situation, depending on how many games he was back for, how essential he was to the team's fortunes, we may rate him as the starter still. But what's very important to remember, because of the team card concept here, if the guy has been a starter almost all the games he played or all the games he played, but he doesn't have enough starts to qualify for that position for us, he's not going to be rated as a sub. Because chances are he's a lot better than the guy who replaced him. And we're not going to have the subs be better than the starters. He's not a starter if he didn't play 8 games now, unless an exception. All right, so you get a guy who started the first 4 or 5 games, goes down with an injury for 10 games, comes back for a couple. We'll probably rate him in that situation as the starter. Also, if a guy was extremely important into the team's postseason,
Bob Sanders rule.
Exception as well, okay? Yes, Sanders you have a very good memory. I was not doing the ratings then, but this is a very good example. Bob Sanders was an all-pro safety for the Colts the year they went to the Super Bowl. I think he had 5 starts during the regular season. But he came back either for the last game or for the postseason. He played all the postseason games and was instrumental in the Colts' run to the Super Bowl. So he got a rating from Strat-O-Matic as a starter. But that is an exception.
All right, we have a couple players. I feel kind of badly like running down these individual players with you, like I'm putting you in the hot seat or whatever. But
go for it.
All right, so we got a few guys.
People on the hot seat when I was a journalist.
Okay. Well, we got a few players. To card or not to card. That is the question.
Yeah.
That we had questions about. So Chris Lindstrom, the guard on Atlanta, was he a guy that played early, got hurt, and then came back late?
He's a backup.
Is he rated? You have him as a backup on Atlanta? Is that right?
Let me look him up.
I think he's a starter. You got him as the starting right guard 4-3. He only played 5 games and started 5 games, I believe, for Atlanta. So he was a guy who people wondering why did he get carded?
Okay, Lindstrom, come up here. He did get carded, right?
Yeah. He's carded as a starting right guard for Atlanta. He had 5 starts for them in the NFL.
He started the first game of the season. Then he started the last 4. So that's the example of a guy who starts the season as a starter, goes down, comes back to finish the season. That's why he got started.
All right. Now, a guy that people were comparing him to was Derwin James, of course, the great safety for the Chargers. Yep. They said he was hurt for most of the season, came back, and now this is what people have told me. I didn't confirm this, but they say that he started the final 5 games of the season. Is that all right? And how come he doesn't get carded?
He was a borderline call. He did not start the season. He just finished it. So that's a little bit different from the norm of what we're talking about here. And this is also one where the team is involved. James is great. And to give a guy a 6, which he probably deserved, for 5 games, for a team that didn't even advance to the postseason, I thought would distort the performance of the team. So Anthony Phillips got the spot as a strong safety. He only started 5 games. He played 7. He was really the guy who would have been James' backup, but in this case, didn't feel like a 6 was warranted for the Chargers at that spot. But it was a close call.
Well, I can understand that. That makes some sense. That obviously the impact of Derwin James as a safety 6 compared to some right guard 4-3 is a lot greater. But I've got a question that I just thought of it when you mentioned it. Why are you guys differentiating between if a guy started, got injured, then came back, or was injured from the beginning of the season and then came back late. I don't know why. Honestly, what's the differentiation there? Forget about Joe and James, just in general.
It's a fair question. But 5 starts is not usually going to get you the rating as a starter. And that's what James had. Lindstrom had 5 starts, but if you look at Atlanta's other players, you got the other guards are Schweitzer and Brown as the backups, who really were nothing. They were very poor. Schweitzer split his time between guard and center, mostly guard. So it's a borderline call in both cases, and you can have a fair argument to say, well, gee, I think one guy deserved as much as the other. There are judgment calls in both cases. In both cases, we could have justified carded neither one of them. We decided to give Lindstrom a rating. And as you say, giving Lindstrom a 4 over the Zeros who would have played ahead is not as big a deal as giving James a 6. Now, could I have downgraded James and say, well, he only played 5 games, doesn't deserve the 6 that he otherwise deserved? Yeah, could have done that. But in the end, it's a call you can quibble with. But if there's not a hard and fast rule, it says you got to do it.
Yeah, I got you. Okay, yeah, you got to make the decision one way or the other, and you could. And yeah, I could say these two cases.
I'm not going to say you're wrong if you want to argue it the other way. It's just if there's not a hard and fast rule, it says it has to be this way.
Okay. What about? We only got a couple more of these. What about Russell? Is it Russell? Russell Okung, the offensive left tackle for the Chargers, played 6 games. I think they said he started, didn't get a card at all. Do you know what his circumstances were like?
Let me look him up, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, Okung did not finish the season. He started 6 times, which is not the 8 that we require, and his season was done after week 14, or started done after week 14.
Okay, so you have to play at least 8 games, unless you start the year, go out with injury, and then come back. Is that what it is? That's
the norm. Okay, so
the norm, but there will be exceptions.
Talking about some exception, the Bob Sanders or whatever. But even Sanders, we're talking about a guy who was very important to the postseason, right?
Absolutely.
And so he had his starts for the regular season, but he also had the additional starts in the postseason. And to made the Colts in that situation without Bob Sanders would not have truly reflected their performance for the year. The other teams we're talking about here, Atlanta, the Chargers, those teams are not postseason teams. So, they were not. It wasn't like these guys had a extra important role that had to be reflected in the team's performance. Okung is a classic example of a guy we don't rate. He didn't start 8 games. He didn't finish the season. He's not going to be rated as a sub. He didn't get enough to be the starter.
Okay,
and two guys on the team who were tackles who started more than Okung did. There's no way to justify Okung being the starter.
Sure, Tevye and Scott. And of course Sanders had a tremendous impact on the entire NFL season because their defense played so much better when he was in that postseason, and they won the Super Bowl, which is certainly not the case for Atlanta and the Chargers. So,
if that really changes the team, and the team's performance is something that really has to be reflected because of their success in the late season that wasn't there early. That's another consideration.
All right, then we have another question regarding players getting carded or not carded, and I think we know the answer because the guy posited a great possible answer to it. For example, Giants have a backup inside linebacker named Ryan Connolly, who only played 4 games. He's rated as a 003. And like, boy, he's only rated for 4 games. But the guy, I think you've already answered this. Basically, you have to find the backup linebackers for depth charts and this and that. So this is the guy who ends up getting it, a guy like that, right?
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, there's no minimum for being a sub. I've already said that, and we also want to rate guys who had sacks. There's no controversy here. I mean, right. He had 4 games, 3 starts. He had a sack.
Yeah. Well, for us, not necessarily controversy. Just looking for information on how it happens, and now we're getting some. So, Dennis, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Back up in.
Asked and answered, Tom. Asked and answered.
Exactly.
Let's go on to another position group. We talked about the blocking backs having their run blocking lowered. This year, we've seen a lot more 6-rated pass defending linebackers. We have 14 this year compared to only 6 in 2018 and 5 in 2017. Now this seems to be kind of going back to the way it was previous to the last 2 years, because there were 15 high-rated pass linebackers in 2016. So what's the reasoning behind the sudden jump back up to having more 5s and 6s as a pass defenders at linebacker?
Well, I can tell you why it happened, and I can also speculate on what conditions caused that. It happened because the statistical information we had and the scouting reports we had and the reading we had justified those guys getting high ratings. Also, every year, I have a target. It's not a hard and fast rule, but we try to be very close to it for the number of 0s, 4s, 5s, and 6s among the starting defenders. And every year it becomes part of the puzzle for how to do that.
Let me interrupt you. Saying,
wait a minute, let me finish this.
Okay,
first.
good.
And that is, it's not by position group.
Okay, that's my question.
It's by the entire defense.
Okay.
All right. So one year you can be heavy on 0s in the secondary. You could be heavy on 0s in the defensive line. You could be heavy on 0s in linebackers, or 4s, 5s, and 6 heavy. All right. So that's how it happens. It turns out that sometimes we cannot give a guy a 0 on the defensive line who richly deserved it, because there's a sub who had more sacks than he had. And the sack makes that sub a better player, and the sub is not going to be a better player. And no worse, he'll be equal. The starter will be no worse than equal to the sub. So in a situation where you've got a starter who deserves a 0, let's say he's a nose tackle, and had maybe 1 sack for the year, and there's some sub who was probably used more in pass rush situations and had a sack and a half, and is going to get a higher sack rating, but also deserves a 0, then I've got to make the starter a 4. So now I have too many 4s in one place, and I've got to put more 0s in another. Well, the same works with 6s and 5s. And so some years the borderline calls will go for the secondary, or go for the linebackers, or go for the defensive lines to balance out, to hit closer to those overall targets. So that's the how. That's the why it happened that way. But why is it that linebackers, some of them, more of them than usual, look better against the pass? Well, I say, again, I think this has a lot to do with the specialization in the NFL. The guys staying on the field in pass situations who are not blitzers are likely to be the ones who really can defend. But I'd have to do a bigger analysis on that to cite the trend. I do know that when you're talking about a Wagner or Kuechly or some of the guys who are really excellent in pass coverage, that's not a tough call at all. But just turned out there were more guys eligible for 6s this year, and there was room to give more 6s.
So there was no this increase in the linebacker pass coverage 6s this year. It does not reflect any sort of philosophy on the part of you and the company. Just the individual performance of the players you felt was worthy of that this year.
Correct. So don't set your sights on saying you're going to get this many 6s or approximately this many 6s in pass coverage linebackers next year.
All right, and as you mentioned, then the same would, I guess, go true for the free safety position, where this year you have 19 out of 32 free safeties, rated 5 or 6, only 2 as a 0, whereas last year was only 13. So again, just the individual free safeties warranted it, in your view, nothing to do with the long pass not being as good or whatever.
Well, yes, you're right. However, I think we do spot something in the NFL this past year, and that is the number of good young free safeties. So Minka Fitzpatrick, for instance, had not been a free safety, but Steelers put him there, and he was great. He's a Pro Bowl starter. And Buda Baker was the Pro Bowl starter. Eddie Jackson, young guy. Anthony Harris switched positions with Harrison Smith. Anthony Harrison became the free safety and did a phenomenal job. So there were more good candidates in the first place, and it was easier to give those sixes. I will say that there is a consequence for that, and you'll see it in the thrills and chills columns, which the first of the two installments is online now. And that is, there are some really bad team long pass cards.
That makes sense. So like you said, the stock leagues are the focus there. So that you kind of have to balance that out. Higher ratings, worse cards.
If you get 6 at free safety, those defensive back and zones are all going to be incomplete, right?
Sure.
Right, exactly.
And so guess where all the completions go?
Okay. No. Let me ask you a question, Glenn. With the increase in linebacker sixes against the pass this year and free safeties 5s and 6s this year, you said there's a fixed number of 0, 4, 5s, and 6s for the whole set, regardless of position. So where is this set soft? Where is this set soft on 5s and 6s as a result of those linebackers and free safeties getting more?
Well, I would say it has to be on the defensive line, but it could be cornerback. I didn't do that. I've forgotten what targets I hit this year on that.
Okay, just curious.
The targets are approximate, so it can be off by a few. For the usual, if you call it a quota, targets are can be off a few from year to year.
So it's more of a narrow range, perhaps. Is that best?
Correct. It's a target, but it's not an immovable target.
Well, I think that's the most comprehensive answer we've gotten on this question. A lot of people in the online community look at these things closely, have been obsessed for years, saying, I think they give a certain number of corner 6s every year, a certain number of offensive tackle 6s every year, but now you're saying no. Now, you mentioned that on the defense. What about on the offensive line with 4s? Is there a fixed number of 0s, 4s, 5s, and 6s for the entire NFL amongst the starters that you give?
Target for the offensive line run blocks.
As well, another narrow range.
But this year, for the first time, we didn't even try to hit those targets as hard as we have, because there is now a well-established trend in the NFL of inferior offensive line run blocking. And this has been something NFL coaches have been complaining about for years. And that is that so many players coming out of college never played in a three-point stance. They've been in spread offenses. It's not only been passing almost all the time, but when it has been running, it's been trap blocking. The idea of power blocking and learning the techniques, using your body for that kind of power, just isn't happening at most of the colleges. So the exceptions are places that run pro-style offenses: Alabama, Michigan, Notre Dame, maybe Southern Cal. These teams produce a fair amount of offensive linemen that are more ready to play in the pros than otherwise. So we have now reached a point, after several years of this, where the statistical ratings and the scouting reports I've gotten, both of the last 2 years, have said there's no way there's enough guys for the 5s and 6s to justify it. So last year, I kind of forced it to hit the targets anyway, because it was the first year I saw that in the statistical and scouting report analysis. But this year, the trend is now very well established, and it was even more so. And so I talked to Hal Richmond about it and said, it's going to be hard to hit these targets accurately with the guys the way they really performed. And he said, hey, look, this is the trend in the NFL. Go with it. So you're going to see overall more 0s and more 4s on the offensive line.
Can you give us a rough idea of what percentage of the traditional targets you hit? You know what I'm saying?
I can't give you the percentage of the targets. That's Strat-O-Matic formula stuff.
Okay, all right, understood.
Hey,
Well, we know the big answer is there are fewer. That's all that matters.
Yeah, the offensive line run blocking is weaker.
Okay, Dennis, do you have a question?
No, we're just going to move us along because a lot of these things that we have in here, kind of we touched on the PFF rating, the correlation. We talked about the young veterans or whatever. That has nothing to do with.
We didn't quite. I mean, I think we're okay on time here, but I don't know. Some of them I want to just reinforce a little bit, if you don't mind. So we can see, because some things do come in the conversation. You just want to make sure that they're out clearly. So as you said earlier, let me say this. It seemed to me like a couple of years ago, there was about a 3-year spread or so where there's a lot of correlation between the Strat ratings and the PFF grades. And then I felt like it was a little less so last year, and this year a lot more divergence. Now you said earlier that, hey, we've got all these various sources, we've got our own scouting, and you told us everything that you do. Can you say if there's been any trend where maybe this year, last year, PFF is less of a factor, or it's just always been that way, and maybe I'm out of my mind?
It's just not as authoritative a determinant for us as some people want it to be. I think people want it to be because they want something they can rely on. They can look it up, and it's valid as far as I'm concerned for someone to say, hey, this guy got this great statistical rating or this very poor statistical rating in PFF. Why did you do it otherwise? Well, the blanket answer is PFF is one of the pieces. It is not a majority piece. It doesn't have veto power. And it's not the only statistical bit that we use. We also have the scouting. We also have the reading. We also have to fit it in the team concept. And so it's a piece of the puzzle. To say PFF's got this and you give them this, therefore you're wrong. Well, that's your opinion, but that's not the way it's done.
Okay, no, I think that was important for people to hear. So that's why I touched on it again.
Sure. Look, I don't mind I think I said this to you in email. I don't mind for questions to come up every single year. We have new gamers. We have new listeners, people who have taken a greater interest now than they used to have. I think it's great to cover this every year if we have to.
Because that's the one that everybody's always like the PFF grades here, this and that. So that's, I think, very important to hammer home and for us to hear again. Dennis doesn't think this is a good question. I'm sorry, Dennis. And that's not a great question, but we're okay on time, so let's go with it. You'll see a lot of times some young guys, 25, 26, who are already established starters. They'll lose a couple of points off of their rating from 1 year to the next. A guy like Jalen Smith's pass coverage rating this year going down from a 5 to a 0. So one of the community members was surprised that dramatic of a drop off in a young veteran. And he was wondering, is it injury? Is it a guy really playing that much poorly this year? So I don't know. I don't have an answer for the guy. I mean, I feel like
I've got an answer for him. I've got an answer for him on Jalen Smith.
All right, good.
I just read an article this week or late last week in the Dallas Morning News that said Jalen Smith, as great as he was in 2018, was very disappointing in 2019. And then he knows he needs to get better, and the team knows he needs to get better. So, A, his performance did drop off a lot. And B, it goes back to what I said earlier about volatility of the performances because the season is so short. The base on which you're saying this guy was great or this guy wasn't great, there's just way more opportunity for a dramatic change in a rating than there is, say, in a 162-game baseball season. In a 162-game baseball season, we do have guys occasionally drop 2 grades defensively, go from a 3 to a 1 or a 1 to 3 or a 2 to a 4, but that's unusual.
Jump in, Prid.
Whereas a 1 grade movement is pretty common. But in football, it can be much more dramatic because there's, you got a 16-game season and many guys don't even play that.
Okay. Fair enough. Dennis, you there or no? All right. All right. So now the edge play, you talked about 3-4 versus 4-3. Well, let me ask you this question too, because it does relate to PFF. So don't get mad at me, please.
Okay, fine.
We have some edge players, and we all know that like these players who end up as strat 3 for offensive, 3 for outside linebackers, they spend a tremendous amount of their NFL time rushing the passer. Okay,
Right.
PFF keeps track of something called coverage snaps. Okay.
Yeah.
And there are 3 guys that I emailed you about earlier today.
Yes.
Lorenzo Carter on the Giants, Jalen Ferguson on the Ravens, and Zadarius Smith now of the Packers, who by PFF spent very little time in coverage, but Strat gave them a 6, a 5, and a 5, respectively, in pass coverage. So can you talk about that? Did these guys spend as little time in coverage as PFF said? And if they did, why do you feel like they still, why do you think they deserve the pass coverage ratings they got?
Well, first, I think the PFF data on that is accurate. Second is, I think in looking back at it, these ratings probably would look better 1 grade lower than they are. They did have very good performance for the time they spent in coverage. And that's why they got those ratings. In Ferguson's case, he also got that rating because there's a backup outside linebacker named Bowser who had more sacks, I think 5 sacks, 2 sacks for Ferguson or something like that, and would really push Ferguson as starter if Ferguson wasn't clearly better on the pass and run ratings. Bowser deserved a 4 in the pass coverage, and so Ferguson got a 5. You could argue that Bowser gets a 0-0, but he really had a stronger contribution for the team than that. And so Ferguson got the benefit on a good defensive team that did very well. So he got a boost. He's easier to talk about. Carter had a couple dozen more snaps in coverage than the other guys. But still, I think he would look better now as a 5, and I think Zadarius Smith would look better as a 4. Looking back at it, I kind of wish I'd done it that way now.
Now, do you ever consider changing these things once the preview is out, or unless it's an egregious case?
We correct errors, but we don't usually go back and say, "Oh, well, maybe you should have done this." The cards are printed, so those are not likely to get changed.
Okay. Dennis, you want to jump in on the rest of these or no?
On the individual players?
Yeah. Should I continue with it?
Well, I mean, really, we kind of covered the whole area of why guys, sometimes they're on the border, 5s and 4s. So I'm not sure if there's anybody here that, we talked about PFF not being the biggest thing. That's why Malcolm Butler's got his 5 instead of maybe a 4 or 0. And Shaquem Griffin, I watched him as a Seahawk fan. He rushed from the defensive tackle spot instead of defensive end. So even though his body style might not fit that typical DTDE, I can see why he got rated to cover backups. And then, of course, he's not like a big impact player anyway. It's not like he's a 0-10 coming up the middle. He's 0-1 or something like that.
Okay.
So,
Shaquem probably should have been rated at outside linebacker. We might make a change on that one. But you did flag me on a guy to look for, and I think it is representative of what we talk about every year. And that is, you mentioned Rob Havenstein's 7 pass blocking.
Yes. There's a guy, Glenn. Do you know Mark Lepage, Glenn?
I know the name.
Mark. Well, you remember Tyke, of course, who used to do the predictions for the Strat Fan Forum for the ratings. Mark Lepage has taken it over the last 4 or 5 years, and he does a lot of homework on it. Does a very good job with it. And he was the one that brought Havenstein to our attention, as well as some other guys that we've talked about and some other concepts we've talked about. I think he mentioned 3 sacks and 3 holding penalties in 9 games or something like that. And he was wondering why a 7 for that type of guy.
Yeah, this is worth talking about every year. And that is the way the pass blocking is done. It is a statistical matter for the team. There is some subjectivity in it, but it is a puzzle in itself with very little tolerance in terms of the variance that I can have. And so if a team overall yielded very few sacks, and first of all, let's make sure we understand. Pro Football Focus assigns sacks in a different way than others do. So don't just take it as a given that a Pro Football Focus said this guy yielded 3 sacks, that's how he yielded. They may be attributing that sack to the quarterback. They may be attributing it to the wide receivers, maybe whatever. Okay, so first of all, we got that, but set that aside. Here's the thing. If a team had very few sacks allowed, its individual pass blockers are going to get the benefit of that, even if their skill level doesn't rise to it. So every year, I'm rating guys 7 who I started thinking should be 4s. Based on the reading, based on the scouting reports, based on the Pro Football Focus input and whatever other statistical matters we have. So, well, this guy's probably a 4, this guy's probably a 5, this guy's a 2. And then I put those in, and then I get back a value. You know, it's like working with a spreadsheet. And I get back a value, and the value will then say, you're off by 6 points. And 6 points is not 6 different rating upgrades, 2 to 3 and 3 to 4, 5 to 7. It's not that way. It's a different kind of formula. You're up by 6 points. This team has to be better. I've got to get down to less than half a point. All right, so it ends up being very fine-tuned. And tackles have more influence on pass blocking than guards, and guards more than centers. So I end up in situations where the only way I can get it done, the only way I can get to that tolerance level is to give guy a 7 who does not deserve it by reputation or by anything that we've got judging him. It's got to come out statistically. Now, in some situations, what happens there is a team performed presumably so well in pass blocking that it had so few sacks when actually the offensive line wasn't that great. And what happened is the offensive coordinator, recognizing the offensive line wasn't that great, decided the quarterback needed to throw a lot shorter passes.
Got it. That makes sense.
Right? So that has happened. You know, we talked about Phillip Rivers a couple of years ago. He's an excellent downfield passer, but his offensive line was so weak that year he's throwing a lot shorter passes. And so in that situation, I'll be mindful of it from the reading. And that quarterback will get downgraded for his long pass ability. And to some degree with his short pass ability, you'll see it more in a flat pass. But so for the offensive line, I've got guys who are getting 7s or 5s who starting the process I didn't think deserved it. Now, one thing I do try to do to the greatest extent possible, and sometimes it's not possible, but most times it is, is say, look, on this offensive line, this guy needs to be the best on his team. And this guy needs to be the worst on his team. And I'm going to try to keep that integrity, you know, so that at least you can say, okay, got it. These guys, you know, this was the strength of the line. This was the weakness of the line. Some teams did well enough statistically, you know, for the process we use that, you know, they end up with 3 7s when maybe they should have had 1 just based on the reading and the scouting.
So to clarify, if I understand that correctly, you mentioned Phillip Rivers and the Chargers a few years ago when their offensive line was in really bad shape. The offensive linemen might have still gotten 4s and 5s and 7s better than they really performed, and you nerfed his long pass card so that the coaches would not throw deep as often.
See, you're right, exactly. So what the pass blocking is trying to do is replicate the number of sacks. So it becomes important how that happened. All right, so statistically, I've got to give these guys 7s or 5s when maybe the scouting report and the reading says otherwise. And even the offensive coordinator's play choices said otherwise. But I can then have the team look like the team. You know, they're going to have to throw more sharp. Yeah. They have to throw more flat passes because the short pass and long pass isn't going to be as successful as it otherwise would have been. And that's, in fact, what happened. And of course, if you're throwing a lot of flat passes, what happens? You're going to get fewer sacks.
Sure.
So the team ends up working very well that way, I think. But you have some individuals who say, boy, it kind of hurts me to give this guy a 7.
I gotcha.
And it happens more than once or twice a season. I mean, it can happen a couple times each on several teams.
Okay.
Now, sometimes it's reverse. Sometimes you got some talented guys, but maybe they had an injury and a rookie, and maybe they did have a quarterback who held on to the ball too long, and they took a lot of sacks. Or maybe they were playing from behind a lot, took a lot of sacks. And now guys who, by reputation and how well they're regarded by their peers, they get Pro Bowl votes and so forth. You know, this guy should get a 5. Sorry, he's going to have to be a 4. You know, and just stop knocking him down. Yeah.
We'll call that the Sean McVay correlation or something.
Okay.
Speaking of the way coordinators scheme things up and do things, we noticed 2 guys this year that have a unique rating. Now, in the past, there have been a few players that were rated at safety and inside linebacker, but the effectiveness at inside linebacker or safety, one of those was kind of off. But there's 2 guys this year that have an effective rating in both spots, and that's Chuck Clark and Patrick Chung. So that probably speaks to the way their defensive coordinators use them, but could you talk a little bit about that? Is that something that Strat's ready to adjust if you see more teams using that hybrid type player?
Yeah, what we're seeing in the NFL is that linebackers and pass coverage is not a great idea. And it's a pass-first league. It's going heavier on tight ends, heavier on 3 wide receiver sets. And so defensive coordinators are using more defensive backs. And in fact, you'll see a quote, you can never have too many defensive backs on a team. And so this year, if you look at the number of starts by players in the secondary, New England's a great example. New England's famous for moving players around like crazy, but Patrick Chung's always been a strong safety. This year, look at the numbers. In the secondary, counting Chung as a safety, 77 starts. So with a 4-man secondary, that's 64 starts, right? Now you got 13 extra starts. Guess where that came from? Came from the linebacker spot. And the reading I did, I specifically went back and did more reading on the Patriots than what I already had. And it was that Chung was being used in a linebacker spot more often, where he'd be very close to the line. He had coverage responsibilities for tight end in a 2 tight end offense and otherwise. And so to get the starters on the field who needed to be on the field and not have a guy who started 2 games at linebacker be a starter, Chung became starting a linebacker with a safety rating as well, instead of just a strong safety.
Is a good way
the way the team played. So
is a good way to think of that, sort of like that nickel safety defense that that they're playing. They've got like 3 safeties on the field at one time.
Yes, I mean they're usually putting that guy in the box, and but he's got coverage responsibilities. So he's there to fortify against the run in a 2 tight end offense against them, but he's also got coverage responsibilities. And the Ravens had that same situation with Clark. I'm looking to see how many starts they had. 80 starts in secondary.
Oh, wow.
So you can tell what happened, right? You're starting 5 secondary guys every game.
Yeah.
And so one of those guys is either going to have to be a sub in Strat-O-Matic, or he's going to start where he actually played, in the box, as a linebacker.
Sure.
Because otherwise, I mean, the linebackers on this team, 6 starts, 3 starts, one guy 16, that's Judon. 9 and 7. So he really got about 2.5 starts at linebacker. And some of that linebacker were guys who shifted into a little defensive end situation. So, that's where the puzzle comes in. Looking at the numbers, reading about the team and how it played best and how it functioned well, and saying, how can I do this, within the Strat-O-Matic constraints, which is somewhat formulaic and somewhat the constraints of playability. Let's make sure this game plays well and you don't end up with a complicated.
I think it's a good move, certainly. So, hey, Glenn, you mentioned that I should ask you about quarterback end run. Is there a change in quarterback end run? What's going on there? Dennis wants to hear all he can about quarterback end running.
I'll bet he does. I thought of Dennis right away when we started doing this, because no one cares more about Russell Wilson than Dennis. So
not even Mrs. Wilson.
Dennis, nobody knows more about Russell Wilson in the Strat-O-Matic community than you do, right?
Well, I don't know about that, but
so we're going to test your knowledge.
I do know about that, Glenn. It is true. No one knows more about Russell Wilson, period, than maybe Dennis and maybe his mom or something. I don't know.
Dennis maybe was his best man or something. I don't know. But we got. I'm gonna quiz you here, Dennis. How many runs did Russell Wilson have this year that were not scrambles, and how many yards did he get on those runs?
Well, I know that his statistics were something like 72 runs for 350 yards, somewhere around there. But he does not really use the designed runs like they used to. So you're not seeing those read option runs where he purposely runs. And if they do run that, he'll hand the ball off 90% of the time until it gets to the fourth quarter, where then he needs to pull one out of his hat. So I would probably, if I was going to guess, I would say maybe he did 15 to 20 designed runs last year, and the rest were scrambles. But again, I could be wrong. I could be totally off on that.
No, actually, very good. I really admire your analysis. So here's the thing. This year, when we did a couple years ago, we started taking the kneel downs out of the quarterback run averages and said,
thank God,
let's rate the runs just on the runs, right? Okay. Now, the consequence of that is it has produced some mighty end run cards for quarterbacks. And this year, after we did it the usual way, the way we've been doing it the last few years, one of the testers said, are you sure you want to give these kind of end run cards to some of these guys? It's like the whole end run wrong column is quarterbacks are short gains, except for one result or two results. And said, okay, well, let's take a deeper look at it. So we went deeper into the data. And I made sure we had data that said how many of each quarterback's runs were scrambles and how many of them were other runs. And what was their yardage on the other runs. So Russell Wilson, who was going to get an end run card, but not a very mighty one this year, ended up not getting an end run card at all. And here's why. He had exactly 15 other runs for a total of 26 yards. He can get that on sneaks.
Sure.
So he's not going to get an end run card. And some guys who would have been pistol quarterbacks are not going to get pistol quarterback ratings anymore. We got a half a dozen who will. But we started off with the possibility of 9. And we eliminated end run for several guys based on those numbers. So now there are some guys who you might have expected to get end run cards and quarterbacks who will not have it. And some guys' end runs will be adjusted for yards as well because their average on end runs on other runs other than scrambles turned out to be quite a bit less than the numbers we would have used by the traditional formats. So that's something to look for this year.
Well, that makes some sense because we have seen some guys who you don't think of as guys who run designed runs, who get some pretty nice end run quarterback cards. Like Aaron Rodgers, I think maybe last year or something like that, had a really nice end run quarterback card. And he's not a guy you think of as going to be doing designed runs with. You know what I'm saying? So,
that makes sense. I'm glad you guys are digging deeper into the numbers. So
absolutely.
That means he still has good must-run columns, but not the end run.
Right. So we've got like, I think there's something like 13 guys with an end run column this year. And I don't think Rodgers is one of them.
Dennis will survive. I think he'll be fine.
I'm okay. I'm good.
Okay, good. We want to keep you around.
Yeah, good, Glenn. Let's talk about pass rush for a minute. Mark Lepage, who I told you earlier, does the predictions, does a tremendous job with them. And he's been, I think, doing more and more work and going deeper every year and getting better and better at them in general on the Strat Fan Forum. He said that he told me that he felt like this year in general, the average pass block had gone down about 1 for a lot of the starting players, more than he expected. He said he also thought that the pass rush had gone up about 1 for your average defensive lineman and maybe a little more for linebackers. Is that true or false?
It could be true, but it wasn't by design. It was by statistics. So as I told you how the pass block works. And so if the pass block ratings are down 1 on average, it's because there were more sacks.
Yeah.
And if there were more sacks, then guess what? You're going to have more pass rush ratings that are higher. Now, if you're going to turn around and tell me there weren't any more sacks this year, I would say that's an anomaly then, because it's really formulaic for both.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it did seem like there were more sacks in the NFL over the last year or two. Maybe they've been blitzing more because sitting back, you're getting killed with these quick hitting passes. So, okay, so that might be the case, and if so, it's statistically driven.
Yes.
Dennis, want to ask this next one or no?
Sure. So, well, first of all, before we go on to that, I guess you're talking about the one with the autoplays. Is that what you wanted to go next?
Well, I forgot about that. I was talking about the formula for.
Yeah, that's not got it. The formula for determining pass rush. So you mentioned that you will correct mistakes, like in a data patch. I think the forum guys noticed a couple guys that had a sack or two, but they were given 0 ratings. So we should just compile those and send those to you.
This year, I can talk about that right now. That was a data problem this year. We switched data providers, and there were probably 6 or 8 guys who showed up in their data as having 0 sacks, but they actually had a sack or 2 or more. In several cases, these were guys who switched teams in midseason, and I guess the data provider just did not pick that up properly. So we have talked to the data provider about correcting that for next year. I just had to correct one the other day. It was brought to my attention by Len Schwartz of Strat-O-Matic. It's someone who brought it to his attention. Jeffrey Simmons of Tennessee had 2 sacks, but was given 0. I looked back at the data; it showed 0. It wasn't right. His actually had 2 sacks, and so his rating actually needs to be a 2. So that'll be corrected.
And what about backups? Some guys who get like maybe 5 sacks, but they play the snaps, way less than the starter. Do you boost up their sack totals so that they could match those if they're only in there some of the time, or is it based on, like, if he has 5 sacks, he's going to be a 5?
Well, it's never as clear cut as if he's a 5 sacks, he gets a 5. But no, we don't. There is an adjustment for playing time. However, that is to make the relationship between sacks correct for the team. So a guy with 5 sacks at linebacker is going to get a 1 sack rating lower than a teammate linebacker who had 6 sacks. But that's not true for defensive linemen. Defensive linemen are considered separately from linebackers. So don't assume that if a defensive lineman had fewer sacks than a linebacker, he might get, a lower rating. It's actually the linebackers tend to get higher ratings because they aren't always blitzing. So let me rephrase that. Let me rephrase that and say compare linemen to linemen and compare linebackers to linebackers and compare them only within their own team.
Got it. What about somebody who only played like the last 5 games of the season or 6 games of the season? He got a card. He got a certain number of sacks. Are you prorating that what he would have gotten over the full season, or it's just based on the time he played?
It's basically he's basically considered that is his whole season.
How about skill players? So like somebody like Rob Gronkowski 2 years ago, where he played half the games, but his card was rated really strong. So you're not looking at just the total statistics, but you're more looking at like a per game number of statistics. Is that correct?
Looking at both. A guy who had 98 pass catches like Allen Robinson. First of all, let's make sure we got the baseline right here. We're talking about pass catching combos, are we not?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So you get a guy like Allen Robinson in 98 catches. He's not a really good passing team, but Robinson's obviously the offense on that passing team, and he's got to make sure his catches are up there, because it's not Trubisky who made Allen Robinson better; it's the other way around. So the puzzle part of this is, first of all, we have a statistical basis, and the catches per game is a factor in that. It is not the only factor. All right, then we have the scouting reports. And if the scouting reports and the statistical basis both indicate this guy should have, say, long pass combos of 9 and 15, and that's what he'll get. But quite often, there's a discrepancy between the scouting report and the statistical basis. The scouting report will say this guy's really a threat deep. But in fact, statistically, the guy did not catch a single pass more than 21 yards. Sorry, he's not going to get the maximum catch or anywhere near it to the long pass though, right? Okay. Or conversely, this guy is really not such a great hands guy, but he had tremendous number of catches. We have to reconcile that. Well, reconciliation is done on common sense, as in the first example I gave you, the guy who didn't have a long pass catch. And also a look at his numbers across the board. And I will look at pass catches per game. I look at average yards. I look at how many catches he had at various ranges, 10 to 19, 20 to 25, 25 plus, 30 plus. And also, we have to consider the way the guy was used. So, one guy might have a lot of catches on a team. However, he might have benefited greatly from being in single coverage all the time, because the other guy, the other wide receiver, was a star who was almost always double teamed. So when I have that situation, I have to consider bumping up the combos for the guy who's always double teamed, because he's going to lose a lot of catches in that double teaming. And a grain of salt on the guy who had a lot of catches the other ways, because he's never double teamed. And then there's one more piece of the puzzle, and I alluded to it with Trubisky. And that is, on this team, did the quarterback make his receivers better, or do the receivers make the quarterback better? And sometimes that varies by receiver. So Matt Ryan might make a secondary or third receiver better, but Julio Jones makes Matt Ryan a better quarterback. And so I have to consider that as well. Combos are done first. Quarterback completions are done after that.
Okay, interesting. I've got a question, Glenn, that I'd like to ask you. All right, so we know that every year Strat has their play testers, right? And you have these guys all to play a huge number of seasons, and one of the things you're focusing on is the stats coming out, fairly accurately, correct?
Well, I don't know how many autos play seasons they're doing. I'm not actually part of the testing process. I hear about their findings later. But yeah, we want the stats to be good. But again, you're working with 16 games. We really want the team to play right.
All right. Well, let me ask you a question. So when they're doing those, when they're playing, and I know you want the team to come out right, you want the stats to be decent. What rules options are they using?
I don't know.
Oh.
I'm not part of that process. I can't be, but I got plenty to do. So, it would be Bob Winberry driving that.
Okay. All right. Maybe I'll email you after the show, and we'll try to do some investigation. That we're just kind of curious. Okay. Dennis, you have anything with Dennis? You want to follow up or something, or
no? We can move on to the Kurt's
special teams.
Yeah, Kurt Klein had some ideas on special teams. Now we've seen some changes in the way kickoffs are handles and those types of things. Do you have that handy? I think I left that email over here.
Yeah, I do have it. I'll bring it up on the screen. Kurt Klein, long-time online community member.
Well, you want me to talk about him? You want to ask me specific?
Hold on. Do you have that to ask, Tom? Did we lose Tom?
I have it. If you want me to go over it, guys.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Now, first of all, let me say that I do no work on the special teams,
right.
But I do know some things that will be helpful here, I think.
All right. So yeah, I found it. So this is where he's basically looking for accurate fumble numbers for special teams guys, looking for a 50-50 split. Well, let's talk about one at a time, I guess. So, really he's trying to see if he can maybe get some improvements to the special team system, because we know we're at a disadvantage because of the 2 through 12 50-50 split that we're doing. And is it possible to use like 2/3 to 1/3 split instead of 50-50?
I'm back.
Well, is it possible? I mean, sure, but I'm not so sure it's necessary or desirable.
Sure. You had mentioned that you were willing to talk about 1, 3, and 4. So 1 is the accurate fumbles for special teams. 3 is the realistic returns on free kicks and squibs. That's really the one I was trying to think of. So when guys do the whole issue of when you do after a safety and you punt it away and you get these crazy numbers where it goes 70 yards down the field and then the guy, the return says -3 and he's in the end zone. You go from one safety to another, kind of, that's a rare case. But there are things like that where it just doesn't seem like after a free kick, after a safety, that the returns accurately reflect what happens in the NFL. Let's talk about that one.
Okay, so some people will be happy to know that there's a rule change this year on that, on the free kicks, on the returns.
Yay.
And you'll see it in what should be posted very soon, article that I put together on the improvements to the Windows game this year. But rule changes for the Windows game almost always are applicable to the board game as well. And so there will be for both a different way of calculating the return on free kicks that will increase the yardage on free kick returns. So that's going to happen.
Great.
I see that he also raises a question here about getting rid of onside kick and squib returns when figuring the kickoff return numbers. We already do that.
Oh.
Is that something that changed over the years? I remember there was a lot of disgruntled gamers when Devin Hester got like a lousy kick return call one year because people were squib kicking the Bears, so he didn't have as much real estate to return the kick, so his average was low in the NFL.
Well, if after the fact you say, well, this guy returned 4 kickoffs for touchdowns or 6 kickoffs for touchdowns, I'm not kicking deep against this team. Guess what? He's not going to get his average, is he?
Yeah, no, but then in Strat, he's getting like 14 to 15-yard returns, and they get the ball.
If you're taking away his chances to get long returns, what's going to happen? His average is going to go down. So
he was a special case, I guess. So, but
yes, he was, and it seems you adjust based on your hindsight. And I suspect somewhere in that NFL season, some team said, we have some foresight here. This guy's too dangerous to kick to. But only after he'd already had great success, right? So sure. I don't think that's a fair way to analyze a guy's statistics if you deliberately distort the environment he plays in, because it's to your competitive advantage to do so. You have to understand you're changing the stats. This happens in baseball all the time. Guy says, well, this guy hit too many homers for me. Well, yeah, you batted him 80% against left-handers when in real life you batted 20% against left-handers. And it's going to change things, isn't it? Or you put him in a different ballpark. Sure. Or this pitcher did a lot better because now you put him on a team with a bunch of 1s and 2s in the infield, but he was surrounded by 4s on his own team.
Sure.
So if you change the environment, if you change the rules of play, not necessarily what you're allowed to do, but what you choose to do, you're going to get different results. The closer you play to actually the way it was played, the better your results should be. But you should never get exact results. There's randomness in dice rolling. And frankly, if you want true randomness in dice rolling, you need about 10,000 rolls. So you're not going to get that in a 16-game season. You don't get it in a 162-game season for individual stats. You can get it for league-wide stats. And in baseball, Strat-O-Matic baseball, it's pretty common to have the league-wide average be within 1 point of the actual. A lot of guys who vary by individuals, by 20 points, 30 points, 40 points.
So, Dennis, I think next game we play, we'll roll 10,000 times for each result to make sure we get a nice random.
There you go.
Yeah, we'll do that to see who.
I don't think any of us want the exact stats.
No, certainly not.
Yeah.
If all you wanted was to reproduce the stats so accurately that you could see very little variance, then you don't need to play at all. Just look it up.
Yeah. Exactly. So one thing that's changed in the last couple of years in the NFL is the onside kick recovery chances. And that's because they don't allow teams to get a running start. You can only have so many people on one side of the line. So is Strat going to be able to maybe give an onside recovery chance based on the year that the game's being played, or how is it going to handle that going forward?
Well, the NFL keeps changing, don't they? So the NFL's seriously considering changing next year to the 4th and 15 situation. If you're instead of an onside kick, you can take the ball in your own territory with 4th and 15. So until there's a stability in the NFL, I don't think you should probably look for a rule change every year in Strat. But we did have a situation, Strat at one time, the standard was, and I think it's still true on the X chart, that there are 4 chances out of 36 of recovery by the kicking team.
Now it's 6.
That's 11%. The historical average before the last couple of years in the NFL was 12%. So not a lot to quibble about there. But 2 years ago, season 2018 season, 2019 season, we've seen dramatic change because of the way the NFL has done things. And teams are now not bothering to try to onside kick in situations where they can catch the team by surprise. There's not enough reward for it. So they're only trying the desperation kicks that were never easy to recover. And the numbers have plummeted. So in 2018, I looked it up. I think the recovery was 4 out of 52. And this past year, it was 1 out of 29. So I think probably right now we're at a stage where people who really care about cutting this finer probably need to have their own adaptation of a rule. Now, I realize you don't have that chance when you're playing a computer game. But if you're playing the board game, you can just say, hey, look, instead of recovery on 2, 11, and 12, just recovery on 2. and they give you about 3%. And 1 out of 29 was about that. So there's a way to adapt it for a board game player if they really care about getting it that close. But then they're going to have to look at it every year. I don't expect it from Strat-O-Matic, but we haven't discussed it in my presence.
Glenn, we've got a couple more things for you, then we'll let you go. I thank you for being with us so long today. Dennis, you want to talk about must run out of bounds with Glenn?
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen that on the forum. So as it is right now, there's no chance for a quarterback who hits a must run to get out of bounds. And I think that Mike Kane was one of the, persons that came up with a rule to make it happen 1/3 of the time at the Brammer tournament and as a board game rule. We'd like to see it. I think most people would like to see it because it's basically, you see it with your own eyes. When somebody hits a must run, there are several times where they're going out of bounds to save clock, but that doesn't happen in Strat. So I guess the question is, has that been discussed as a possible rule change? And what about you personally? Are you in favor of that type of adjustment, or do you think it's fine the way it is now?
Well, I'm generally in favor. The things that happen a lot or at least often enough to be recognizable in the NFL should be able to happen in Strat. And I have if you ever subscribed to StratFan or saw those issues, we had a lot of plan tips to do just those kinds of things. And in fact, we had a pretty good track record with the game company saying, "Oh, you have good data here, you have good logic, good possible solution. We're gonna adopt that rule or that new way of doing things." So one of those things, for instance, was the standard sack in Strat-O-Matic used to be a 9-yard loss. And I documented in StratFan that the average sack was a 7-yard loss in the NFL. Had been for years, and it varied by team. And so Strat said, okay, from now on, we can get a 7-yard average just by rolling 2 dice and using that number, because the middle number, the average, is the roll of 7, and it's a 7-yard loss. So they did that. Fumble. It was a time when the receivers could not fumble.
Yep.
And the quarterbacks did not fumble on sacks. Well, they do now. That was a result of StratFan. So I understand the argument, and I generally agree that something that's happened fairly often in the NFL should be able to happen in Strat-O-Matic. Now, we should have data to support that. It's not enough to say, I see guys going out of bounds, and so therefore.
Right.
I think that my perception, which could be wrong because I don't have the data, is that in a 2-minute drill, when a quarterback gets outside of the pocket, he's usually throwing the ball away. He's not taking the extra seconds to run out of bounds. And that when he's running in a must-run situation, a 2-minute drill, to me, it is more often up the middle, where that's where he's forced to run, as opposed to being able to get outside the pocket and throw it away. He's surrounded, he can't easily throw it away, and he's in the middle of the pocket, and so he scoots up the middle because either he has to avoid a sack, or all of a sudden it's wide open because the linebackers drop back into deep coverage, and he runs up the field as far as he can go, and he slides and pops back up and tries to get to the huddle as fast as possible, and often spikes the ball. I don't see a lot of deliberately running out of bounds on forced to run situations in a 2-minute drill. So I would like to see data that says, here's how often it happens, here's what percentage of time it happens. And if we can get that, then it's a much better situation to take it to the game company and say, what can we do about it?
Yeah, that type of data, is that available in the sources you have? Like, if you were able to give me that, I could go through the game logs, or not really, because you almost need to see a video of those runs.
There are companies that produce data based on play-by-play.
Okay.
Strat-O-Matic has some proprietary data that it pays for, and that's why we were able to do this thing with the scrambles and the other runs.
Yeah, I'm totally willing to do the work if I had a source. But if we can talk offline about that. If you have something for me to dig through, I'll dig through it. Otherwise, I do have NFL Game Pass. I can start going back and watching the last 2 minutes of each half and seeing, documenting those runs if I can. So we'll try to.
It's a lot of work. it's a lot of work versus maybe a lot of money to do it otherwise.
Right. Fair enough.
Depending on how deep pockets you have, so
that's going to get an intern.
Yeah.
The data sometimes is there. You can look at Football Outsiders or something else that, decided to analyze something like this. And I remember there's a really great gamer in our community, a football gamer, Meredith Atkins, who is very particular. He's very precise, and he raised a question several years ago. I want to say at least 3 or 4 years ago now. He says, it's just too easy to convert a 4th and 1 with a quarterback sneak. Just way too easy. It's up, very rare that you can do it.
In the NFL or Strat?
In Strat.
Okay.
So he was looking for a change. And so I said, well, okay, let's look at the numbers. The quarterback right column on Linebuck is the same for everybody. So we can easily say, here's the percentage of time it will be converted on the quarterback's card with Linebuck right. Assuming on 4th and 1 that's the run team is calling run. And you can pretty much look at the defensive cards and say, well, you can get this much, but let's stick with the quarterbacks. Because it's harder with the defensive cards to anticipate how many linebackers are in the zone and what their ratings are. But I then did an internet search for 4th and 1 conversions. And you know what? The percentage of 4th and 1 conversions was exactly the percentage of you can get 1 yard or more on the quarterback run card, right?
Wow.
And so I offer that to make 2 points. First of all, Hal Richmond did a brilliant job in creating this game. It wasn't just a lot of guesswork. Second of all, we all have perceptions. And if they're not backed up by data, they just can be wrong.
Sure.
So it's impressions sometimes create further curiosity to cause somebody to look up the data. But without the data, impressions aren't enough. There might be some things that are so obvious you can't miss it. You don't need a whole lot of data. If you want to say, for instance, wow, teams are doing a lot more with 1 back offenses than 2 back offenses. You don't need a lot of data to prove that, right? Okay. And teams aren't using fullbacks very much. Well, you don't need a lot of data on that to see that, 8 teams don't even have a fullback. All right. But when we start talking about the percentage of 4th and 1 conversions, we start talking about the percentage of time that a quarterback goes out of bounds when he's forced to run, I think we got to have numbers.
All right, I think maybe the last question coming here, Glenn, perhaps, unless Dennis has one after that, dealing with rules proposals, which we've been talking about, special team stuff and out of bounds stuff. All right, so in the NFL, we mentioned earlier the edge rushers, players who line up as an outside linebacker in Strat's 3-4 defense. They rush the quarterback like 90 to 98% of the time, according to the numbers, pretty much, okay? But in Strat-O-Matic, these players have coverage responsibilities for a running back, a blocking back, or a second tight end. In the NFL, they obviously don't give these players coverage responsibility because they're going to be rushing the passer. So I think I made a proposal a year or two ago. Guys talked about something similar this year where you could maybe allow a 3-4 inside linebacker to automatically pick up coverage responsibility on a tight end or a back so the edge guy can blitz the way he does without a problem. What is your view of an engine that has a guy that has you supposed to blitz a guy 90% of the time, but he actually has coverage responsibility? And how can you work around that?
First of all, the 3-4, you can slide the inside linebacker to the outside in the flat pass area, which gives him a certain amount of coverage responsibility right there. So you're only talking about receiver results now.
But the flat pass receiver readings, right and wrong, make a big difference.
Not receiver, the defender rating is really all you're talking about anymore. is if
No,
you
but
saw-
also receiver. If I blitz my outside linebacker and he's covering a running back, and you get flat pass receiver, it's on the wrong column of running back's guard.
receiver, right? So, I think that's a legit question. The rules for different options of coverage now are fairly complicated. So I don't know. I think there's really not usually a tight end problem. Tight end's got strong safety, but your running backs, that is an issue.
Well, if you're running a 2 tight end, 2 wide, that second tight end is covered by the right outside, and that could be an issue. And you said the NFL is doing more of that now. But go continue. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, well, I think that's something worth discussing. I think, however, you're really talking about a pretty complex matrix of who's covering who on what situations. If I blitz the left outside linebacker, then what else is allowed to happen and who covers who and who covers who? I think most gamers don't get down to that level very much. But for those who do, I can understand why you want to see it.
Okay. Dennis, you have anything else for Glenn here?
Well, there was one last question. There's still a lot of cards and dice players that use your solo replay system. And they were wondering if you would ever want to put a video like this together where you're demonstrating how to use that system that would kind of answer some of their questions. Have you ever done something like that, or would you consider doing something like that in the future?
That system has to be 25 years old.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
They love it. They love it.
Around anymore.
Somebody email Glenn his system.
No, yeah, right. I mean, people would ask me for that back issue, and I sold them all out, and I still get asked from time to time. I know that it's an interesting system. I mean, I put it together on purpose because, automating things relatively smoothly is something a lot of people have been trying to do for a long time. But as you may recall, it had 3 levels. Had a sort of an easy and a medium hard level, where the defense you're facing is tough.
I don't think Dennis and I do know, because I don't think we ever.
Okay.
We're not solo guys. We're looking for the head-to-head action.
What I've seen from the solo replay systems is they set up some charts that say this is going to be wrong, this is going to be right. We're going to roll this dice.
Yeah. Well, that's true, but what I also did was move linebackers around. So it said, okay, and this if you roll this number, this left linebacker is blitzing, but if you roll this other number, he's not. So for instance, on the 1 to 6 die, as opposed to the 2 to 12 dice, and so a 1 and 2, it might be the blitz of the linebacker, and 4, 5, 6 not, so that the offense wouldn't just sort of automatically know that if I have this situation where the percentage chances this linebacker is always coming or not. And so I think that was desirable for people. What some didn't like was that the toughest level for the defense was right 2/3 of the time, close to half of the time. And, so it's just too tough, this defense is too tough. And so, maybe the right number would be 60% of the time instead of 67% of the time. I don't know. But my answer was, well, if you're talking about a defense that's right only 50% of the time, it's just flip a coin. That's not much of a coach against you, is it? I mean, the coach is going to know certain situations demand a run call and certain situations demand a pass call, and should be right more than 50% of the time if they're paying.
Nobody's calling run on a Hail Mary pass at the end of the game.
No, or on 3rd and 15, right. and so or 3rd and 10 for that matter. You may say, okay, you're going to get some yards, you might get in a field goal position, but I'm guessing pass anyway. Forget it. Right. And then of course you have certain offenses where it's just, you're silly not to call pass 70% of the time. So the system was pretty good, I guess. A lot of people were devoted to it, but I still think it's the minority of people out there using it. It's a 25-year-old system, and it's not that easy to find.
Well, it comes up. People ask for it. People seem to love it still. So the solo players,
Okay, so your question was, would I be willing to do a podcast on it? And the answer is, I'm just about willing to do anything. So I'd have to dig it out and see where I come up with it, review it myself because I haven't used it in a long time, and then say, okay, yeah, here's how you do it. And here's why it's done this way.
Glenn, if you want to get that 60%, Glenn, you got to bust out the 10 or 20-sided dialect from Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, that's right.
Which Dennis and I have been playing lately, not together yet, but
which is not an unreasonable thing to do when you really want to create a solitaire defensive system that will have flexibility for keying and double teaming. But there are some people who use 6 dice to have their solitaire defense set up, and one decides if it's run or pass, and of course the 2 dice for the result. But then there's other dice to determine down and distance variables, and then the key and the double team. So again, try to keep it playable. There are some people who are very happy to have that kind of detail, have no problem playing a 2.5 hour football game, but that's really not very marketable. Anyway, the answer is sure, I'll be willing to do it. We're gonna have to figure out a time so I can go back do my homework on my own system.
Sounds good. Just reach out if you ever want to do that. One of us will help you get it on YouTube, and then we can show you how to share your screen and see how that goes.
All right, we'll be in touch. What else you guys got?
I think it's it.
I think it's been a lot of topics.
Covered everything? Okay. Well, look,
he sounded disappointed.
First of all, I love the chance to talk to you guys because you're fun to talk to. You're respectful of the game and the hobby. People who are this devoted to the hobby are exactly the people, we want to learn from as well as talk to. And you guys bring up some great points. There have been times when you brought up points that have taken back to the company, and, we've made a tweak here and there. We're very interested. I know I am, and I know Hal Richmond has always been. Bob Winbury has always been hearing from the gamers, on their experience and what kind of results they're getting, and what's their level of satisfaction with the results they're getting. The more you play, the more weight we're going to give to it. The data you come up with it. Some people are so fanatical they've charted the results of every play of their season. 32 teams, 16 games each. I threw this many passes. I got this many, this many plays of 10 or more yards. I got this many sacks, and that's great data to have, right? It's only one replay, but at least it can point in a direction. So it's fun to have it. I think it's fun, to have.
There's nothing wrong with those guys.
And I think it's legit for you guys to fire any questions you want, any questions the community wants. Nothing's off limits. The only limits are my ability to share, Strat-O-Matic trade secrets, not happening, and the limits of my own knowledge. I don't work on a special team card, so I can only give you answers to part of those questions.
I think we had to step up our game next year, Dennis, and get and find even more crazy and arcane things. Since he said nothing's off limits, and he sounded disappointed that we ran out of questions.
Well, I appreciate your kind thoughts, Glenn, on complimenting us, but really, you're the star of this show, and I can't thank you enough for coming on with us. And Tom's right; we will try to come up with some crazy conspiracy theory questions to throw at you next year, and see if we can't stump you.
Well, I enjoy the chance to debunk some of them, and for instance, why is Russell Wilson not getting an end run card this year? And
I totally get that, but I'm thinking more of these. How come I'm ahead by 21 points, and the guy kicks off to me, and I fumble it, or I throw an interception on the next play, or the first time I get in the red zone, I'm throwing it. It always throws a pick. These where the strat is trying to make the games close artificially, and
there's one guy. There's at least one guy who swears that the strat engine is designed to let the losing team come back in the second half, so the game will be closer down the stretch.
Well, I don't write the program, but I'm about 99.9999% sure it's not true. And I will say, however, how many times have you watched NFL games where that's exactly what happened?
Exactly. Absolutely.
First, that as soon as the losing team starts opening it up, the game starts changing. That either they make a ferocious comeback that maybe falls short, maybe not, or everything blows up in their faces and now it's a 40-point game.
Yeah.
And, a lot of this has to do with how realistically are game players even playing their games. First of all, once it's your game, do whatever makes you happy, okay? Now, obviously, you're playing in a league. You have to agree upon certain rules. But you're playing solitaire or your league is like-minded. You want to change something in the game, change it. You think it makes it more fun for you, more realistic, or you get results that aren't even statistically accurate, fine. But it's just understand that if you're making dramatic changes to the way the game is played, if you're playing it far differently than the NFL's playing things, whatever, you should expect to get distorted results.
Dennis, I think we should start doing the 4-point field goal, Dennis.
that idea's been around since 1960s.
Okay.
We do get some crazy requests. By crazy, I mean the guy really hasn't thought through the situation. I go when I had Strat-Fan, a guy said, this guy shut down when the Cowboys were Super Bowl champs. Aikman and Smith and Irvin, they saying, gee, this guy keyed on Emmitt Smith every play, and Emmitt Smith only got 30 yards rushing. And, the obvious answer to that is if he's keying on Emmitt Smith every play, why are you still running Emmitt Smith? And that if you really watch, an NFL team can take a star player out of the game, but they open up the other things. So sure. I can double team, if I'm a defensive coordinator, I can double and triple team a certain receiver and say, this guy is not going to beat me. And he doesn't. He got 0 catches or 1 catches. These are Pro Bowl players. But what happens when you do that? Sometimes the guy on the other side has a career game. And, poor Emmitt Smith, he's running into a 9-man box every time. It's not going to get very far. Adrian Peterson had that problem with Minnesota at a point in his career where the quarterbacks weren't good enough for the defenses to respect the ability to throw downfield. And so Peterson was running into 8-man boxes all the time.
Will we be seeing the AFC thrills and chills today, Glenn?
Whenever Strat-O-Matic decides to post it, so it should be today or tomorrow.
Okay, maybe they're already up. Who knows? Because we've been here for 2 hours. So, all right, Glenn, thank you so much. Very informative. I think we got some good answers to some long-term things, and really appreciate it.
Okay, guys, keep smiling. Have fun.
All
right, Glenn, take care.
Be safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, everybody. This is Tom. Dennis left. Boy, Dennis. I'm still with Glenn. We're going to sign off now. This is our Strat-O-Matic Football ratings preview show with Glenn Guzzo, 2020 edition. I go on the calendar here, Glenn. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm glad you put in questions in the forum. Thank you, Glenn, for taking the time to read them and for emailing with us. And we'll see you guys next year, hopefully. Adios. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.